This morning we start a new sermon series in the book of Mark. We have been in the law, now turn during this season of Lent to the Gospel of Mark, which is a lot about discipleship, very fitting for this season of the year. And as I worked out exactly which passages we were going to cover, we turned to the middle of the book. There's some great passages in here about feeding of the 4,000 and some healings, about Jesus declaring that Jesus is the Messiah, and about taking up our cross and following him, and decided that we were going to hear the story of the Transfiguration on Easter, because there's some interesting things that Jesus says about the resurrection in that story of the Transfiguration. And then from that, Transfiguration on Easter sort of worked backwards to where we would start this morning, and landed on this story about Jesus' interaction with the Syrophoenician woman. Now, I discovered as I studied this passage that there's a lot in here that is in contrast to the passage immediately preceding it. So it made more sense to include a little bit from the story that precedes it, in addition to our focus on the faith of the Syrophoenician woman. So we're going to start in verse 14 of the Gospel of Mark and see what Jesus is trying to teach his disciples and what he reveals about discipleship through his interaction with this Syrophoenician woman. And as we do, let's ask God's blessing as we hear his word. We thank you, Lord, for the words of the Gospel of Mark and its way of showing us discipleship, of showing us how you taught disciples who misunderstood you. Lord, may your instruction for them instruct us as well as we journey through these chapters and as we hear your word this morning. We pray this, Lord, in Jesus' name, amen. So Jesus has been arguing with the Pharisees about some of their laws, specifically about whether you should wash your hands before you eat. Now, they didn't do that for hygiene so much as they did it for ritual cleansing. And after a bit of argument, Jesus makes a point, an important point, in verse 14 where we begin, which says, "Again Jesus called the crowd to him and said, 'Listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles them.'" Now, after he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about this parable. "Are you so dull?" he asked. "Don't you see that nothing that enters a person from the outside can defile them? For it doesn't go into their hearts, but into their stomach and then out of their body." In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. And he went on, "What comes out of a person is what defiles them. For it is from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come. Sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these come from inside and defile a person." Jesus left that place and went to the vicinity of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know it, yet he could not keep his presence secret. In fact, as soon as she heard about him, a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an impure spirit came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek born in Syrian Phoenicia, and she begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. "First, let the children eat all they want," he told her, "for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." "Lord," she replied, "even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he told her, "For such a reply, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." And she went home and found her child lying on the bed and the demon gone. During the last month or so, I have been on an automotive saga. And I talked about that a little bit a few weeks ago, and that continued during this past week when I started driving a used Honda CR-V that I purchased. Now, on Tuesday, I was on the way home from a church meeting on the other side of Los Angeles, and getting on the freeway, I gave the car a little extra gas to get some speed when the car lurched and the check engine light popped on. I was a little bit alarmed about that and asked those in the car if they had any suggestions, and Tom's suggestion was that he had AAA. So that's good. Fortunately, we made it back and didn't need to use AAA. But when we returned home, I Googled what this might be, and it came up as most likely being a problem with the spark plugs. And that made sense because this used car seemed to have been overdue on a spark plug change. And I thought, oh, that's not so hard. I did this once long before, and you just need the right tools for the job. Specifically, you need a torque wrench. Torque wrench tells you, as you turn it, exactly how much pressure is being applied so that you can turn that spark plug with exactly the right pressure, so that you can perceive precisely that you've done it right when you turn in the spark plug. Now, Jesus has been arguing with the Pharisees about doing things just right. And his disciples have been listening in. And this argument is over what makes a person clean or unclean, defiled or undefiled. And Jesus tells a little one-line parable in order to make his point. This little one-line parable in verse 15 saying, nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles them. But the disciples don't get it. They ask him about it. They don't perceive his meaning. And Jesus says, are you so dull? Their perception is dull. It's like swinging a hammer to put in a spark plug rather than turning it perfectly, calibrating it just right with the right amount of pressure. Their dullness is like a hammer. And Jesus can see that their dullness needs some work. Jesus can see that he needs an example in order to teach them his meaning. And so Jesus goes to Tyre in order to show them a woman whose faith and heart is perfectly calibrated, is precisely perceptive, as a contrast to their dullness. And so these stories are right next to each other for a reason. They contrast with each other. The story of the Syrophoenician woman is a living example of what Jesus is trying to teach his disciples against their dullness and against the disbelieving attitude of the Pharisees. But you know, this is a strange story, isn't it? This is a story that seems a bit puzzling. It even seems a bit cruel, the way Jesus calls her a dog. And so let's dig in a bit in order to find out exactly what is going on. Now, Jesus is left from Galilee to the region of Tyre. And you can see from the map up on the screen here where that is. I put a little circle at the bottom of the yellow dotted line to show about where Jesus is when he has his interaction with the Pharisees and his disciples there in Galilee, on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, near Capernaum. That's kind of Jesus' home base. And Jesus heads north to, as you can see, the region of Syria and Phoenicia, which is along the coast there where it's green, and specifically near the city of Tyre. That's where Jesus has gone on this little journey with his disciples. Now, Jesus is going to a region that was well known for exporting pagan religion of the worst kind. You may remember in the Old Testament that the worst king of Israel, Ahab, took a wife from this region. Her name was Jezebel, and she brought in all kinds of pagan worship of the worst kind into Israel. And so that's a strike against this area, in a way, a strike against this woman as someone we might consider, or who the disciples in their dullness might consider, defiled. This woman comes begging for help. She looks for all the world like someone who ought to be defined by being defiled. She's from Syria. She's from Phoenicia, near Tyre, the place where the worst sort of pagan religion gets exported. She is a woman, which in those days made her somewhat unimportant, and she is a Gentile, which made people like the Jews feel like she was unclean. And she had a daughter with an impure spirit. Everything about this woman was a strike against her. And so the people who were watching Jesus interact with her would have been surprised that Jesus even bothered to speak with her rather than ignoring her. But here she comes asking a favor from a Jewish rabbi. They would have been surprised that Jesus talked with her, because in those days, men and women didn't talk to strangers across the gender barrier. In those days, Jewish rabbis didn't talk to women who were outside of their family. And in any case, Jesus has gone to the region of Tyre in order to escape attention, to be a bit undercover, and here she has blown his cover. But Jesus responds in a surprising way. And it was surprising to the people in that day, because they would have considered it perfectly normal for him to have ignored this otherwise unimportant and seemingly unclean person. That would have been appropriate behavior in those days as they saw it. So it would have been surprising to them in their day. But it's also surprising to us in our day because of the way that Jesus speaks to this woman, saying that he's come for the children and not for dogs. This insulting way of speaking that doesn't seem like it's in character for Jesus. Now again, the disciples in their dullness would have been more ready to take a hammer to her, shoo her away, rather than to learn anything from her. But Jesus has come in order to instruct them about what he's just said. Now, the easy thing to do when we hear a story like this is to shake our heads. I do this. To shake my head at the disciples and say, those dull disciples, don't they get it? Don't they understand the point? It's not that hard, as Jesus has said it, about what makes a person defiled or not. Why couldn't they see the point? How are they so dull? But then I have a day like Friday when I went to the AutoZone to purchase spark plugs for my car and ended up back at the store 5 more times in order to find the right tools for the job. Now, the job itself actually went pretty smoothly, but the socket wrench that I bought or the socket wrench, I should say, that I borrowed was too big for the hole where the spark plug was. So I had to go and purchase one that fit. But then I discovered that the adapter didn't fit from the socket wrench to the torque wrench, and so I had to go back and get an adapter. But they didn't have one with the right adapter, so I had to go to the Harbor Freight instead to get the adapter. And so once I was finally confident that I got the right adapter, I ended up, here's the right adapter right here, I got finally the right socket wrench in order to put it in and put it all together and fix my car. Now, you may be counting up those visits in your head and saying, 1, 2, 3, 4. Pastor Zach, you said you went back to the store 5 times, but I only count 4. Well, I have to confess that visit number 3 was a dud, because when I got to the store, I realized that I left my wallet at home. Whoops. And by the time I was driving home from the store in mid-afternoon, I was starting to relate a little bit more to the disciples in their dullness, needing to be taught over and over and over again, realizing that this is just like human nature. And it's not just like that at the store when you're trying to get the right things for a repair. It's like that in our hearts too, as Jesus teaches our hearts how to be like his. How many times, not only have I had to go back to the store, but how many times have I gone back to the same sin? How many times have I judged a person at a glance? How many times have I missed what Jesus put right in front of me to say or to do? How many times? How dull am I, needing instruction over and over and over? How dull are you too? We are people who need continual instruction from Jesus. We are all like the dull disciples. We need Jesus to keep teaching us and teaching us and teaching us. The disciples had revealed their dullness when they failed to understand a one-line parable from Jesus. Jesus speaks to the woman in this story with a one-line parable in order to show them finely tuned perception rather than dullness. And their exchange turns on the nuance of a word in this little one-line parable and in her response. Jesus uses a nuanced word, and then the woman returns with a very nuanced word. Now, Jesus refers to dogs here, but he is not referring to just any kind of dog, like a street dog or a yard dog or a guard dog. Instead, Jesus uses a word for dog that is what we call a diminutive form of the word, like a smaller form of the word, which is to say that Jesus is referring to something, it's not exactly clear exactly what, but something like a small dog or a lap dog or an indoor dog or even a puppy dog. Jesus is referring to the diminutive, small kind of dog. And the woman picks this up immediately and turns it around in her reply to Jesus with a diminutive, small thing of her own, saying, Lord, the children get their food but spill the crumbs, and then the dogs are let in for the crumbs. That little dogs are let in the house for little crumbs. She picks up exactly on what Jesus is suggesting, and she has a very quick-witted reply, precisely calibrated to match Jesus' parable, this one-line parable in the form of a question. And she becomes, right here in the 7th chapter of Mark, the very first person to understand a parable that Jesus is telling. And the parable, that what she says matches Jesus' mission at the moment. That in fact Jesus has come first for the children of Israel. His mission is to them in his ministry, but that he intends also to connect with the Gentiles. And that there's no reason for the Gentiles to wait for food, that both can eat at the same time. She understands Jesus' mission. So this is point number one here. This woman understands Jesus' mission. She has a clarity of perception that the disciples have not yet showed. Just because Jesus' mission is primarily to the people of Israel doesn't mean that there's nothing for Gentiles. She perceives this. She passes Jesus' test, and she asks for help rightly. And Jesus does it. So that's one point. She perceives Jesus' mission and matches his parable with matching words of her own with clarity. And the second thing about this is that Jesus has taken a hammer to his disciples' prejudices against people like her, who they might otherwise consider unclean and defiled, by showing how quick-witted and precisely calibrated her heart is towards Jesus. In a way, he's put their prejudiced assumptions on his own lips in order to show just how wrong those were, that her faith reveals her as undefiled, even though they would have considered her as such in their dullness. She is a living example of what Jesus has been trying to teach in the passage just before this. And what makes it so confusing as we hear it is that Jesus appears to be acting just like the disciples, just like the Pharisees with the words that he uses, going so far as to call her a dog. It sounds like Jesus is doing the opposite of what he says, but Jesus is using those prejudices in order to show how wrong they are, because she doesn't act at all like a defiled person. She doesn't act like a person who has every strike going against her. Instead, the qualities of her heart are revealed. Jesus had spoken in verses 19 and 20 about the qualities of one's heart that make a person defiled. There's a long list of things that we do against each other that are defiling to us. But in her heart, instead, something different comes out. And this is worth thinking about, too, going another step deeper. What is it about the quality of her heart that is undefiled, that's right and good, and which Jesus honors? Because if she had listened, if she had believed the judgments of the Pharisees about people like her, she never would have come to Jesus. If she had been as dull as the disciples in her perception about Jesus, she never would have persisted in asking for help. But she is revealed as neither dull nor defiled. The quality of her heart that rings out most clearly is her love. Her love for the daughter in distress. Desperate love in a desperate situation drives her faith towards Jesus. Verse 25 says, as soon as she heard about him, she went to go see Jesus. She knew there was only one person who could help her, and her purpose was for her daughter, on behalf of her daughter, out of love for her daughter. I mean, is there anything worse for a parent than to see a child in such distress, to see a child suffering so, with no help, no options, no future, ruining life otherwise because of this impure spirit, to have hit the bottom and stuck with no options left for her little daughter. The only option left for the daughter she loved was Jesus. It was Jesus or nobody. And so love is the quality of her heart that drives her to Jesus. The other quality of her heart that keeps her with Jesus through this test and conversation is humility. Humility from first to last. She fell at his feet. She begged for mercy and help. She persisted even though she was called a dog. She cried out to Jesus as Lord. She's revealed as someone who is humble. Humility and love are the qualities of her heart that reveal her as undefiled and not at all dull. And so Jesus sends her home expecting her daughter to be healed. The perfect tense verb at the end of the passage indicates that she would be healed already by the time the woman got home to see her daughter. She was not saying, Lord, you do something and I'll do the rest. No, she was saying to Jesus, Lord, you are going to have to do it all here. I have nothing. Nothing have I to bring but my plea for mercy. Lord, you do it all. And that's how it is in the gospel. We don't help in the matter of our salvation at all, but we cannot. It is Christ from first to last. Our human nature is to want to get to Christ by doing something for Christ, rather than asking him to do it all. Jesus pays it all. Jesus does it all. Jesus brings healing to this woman and her daughter when she asks him and no other to be the solution. So what do we take away from this story? What is Jesus teaching us? Because that's Mark's intention. All throughout his gospel, his intention is to use the misunderstanding of the disciples as the means of teaching them something important. And that we, like the misunderstanding disciples, need to hear all this teaching that Jesus is communicating through the experiences of life and the words that he speaks. That's his intention. I mean, I expect this Honda CR-V of mine that it's going to need work for as long as I have it, dull though I may be as a mechanic. And I expect, too, that my life is going to need work my whole life long. But that I may not be a good mechanic. I may be a very dull mechanic. But Jesus is a master mechanic. And Jesus is working and fixing and doing things in our lives for our instruction in discipleship, that we might follow him and be like him and be changed into his likeness, as we sang this morning. And so what are some things? 3 short things as we conclude this morning, lessons from the text. And one thing is to perceive here the difference between dull discipleship and perceptive faith. Dull faith and perceptive faith. That we do well to admit our dullness and to have those moments when we realize, the sort of moment when you realize you left your wallet at home type of thing. How much we need someone else's help. How dull we are about the qualities of our hearts. To ask Jesus to teach us, to see like he sees and to do like he does. To take a hammer to our perceptions, our dull faith, with living examples, with words from his mouth. I mean, I don't know about you, but sometimes I confess I have a dull humility, a dull love, a dull trust. It's like a halfway humility that lacks urgency to it. It's kind of a self-righteous love that's sort of pleased with itself. But perceptive faith comes to Jesus with deep humility and deep love and deep trust and persistence. Those are the carefully calibrated qualities of an undefiled heart. And the disciples needed Jesus to help them with their dullness just as much as the woman needed Jesus to help with her daughter. So that's the first thing, to understand this distinction between dull faith and perceptive faith, between the dull disciples and the perceptive woman. The second thing is that perceptive faith in Jesus leads straight away into how we treat other people. And this is revealed in the list of sins that Jesus associates with dullness. That long list of sins, most of which have to do with how we treat one another. And then the contrast is the woman whose perceptive faith was driven by love for her daughter. That love for Jesus leads to love for others, and that drives our faith. The urgency of our love, the urgency of our humility, the urgency of our trust is expressed towards others. And Jesus shows them true faith from someone that they otherwise found it easy to ignore. And that's a lesson here too. For me and for you, not to find it easy to ignore other people, but to realize Jesus' work in their life too, and that there may be something to learn and perceive. That perceptive faith sees more than what the disciples could in this woman in their dullness. So that's the second thing. And then the third lesson, I think, is to take note of the specific application of her love for her daughter, is her desperate prayer for her daughter. And so I ask myself, perhaps each of us can ask ourselves, how is it that I am praying for someone like this, for someone else with that kind of urgency and desperation, knowing that it has to be Jesus? Like, who are you praying for with that kind of urgency? This woman gives us a great example of urgent prayer knowing that it has to be Jesus or it won't be done, trusting in him, persisting in faith. And the dull in faith tend to find prayer pretty dull and tend to be pretty comfortable in prayer. But perceptive faith wrestles with God, begs and grapples with Jesus for his mercy. And it has a burning intensity to it. Perceptive faith sees how desperate we are, sees how dependent we are on Jesus, only Jesus, but also how tender are his mercies. And that's what the woman found out in this story too. So let's ask God, praying for those lessons to be real in us.